We have read in the last several nights many scriptures indicating that there would be a departure or a falling away. We're reading again a scripture, and in none of these are there duplications. Something like 18 scriptures, all indicating a departure. 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 1 through 4. 2 Timothy 4, 1 through 4. I charge thee, therefore, in the sight of God and the Lord Jesus Christ, who shall judge the quick, that means the living, and the dead, at his appearing and his kingdom. Preach the word. Be instant in season, out of season. Reprove, rebuke, exhort with all long-suffering and doctrine, or teaching. For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but after their own lusts shall they heap to themselves teachers, having itching ears. And they shall turn away their hearts from the truth, and shall be turned unto fables. Now the teachers did not have the itching ears, the people did. One gentleman a few years ago said that if we would stamp out gossiping, there are two classes of people we ought to hang. One by their tongue and the other by their ears. There is no way in the world that false teaching and its receptivity can be controlled by simply controlling the man who is teaching false teachings. He will simply turn to another man that will teach him. For every false teacher, there must be some who have itching ears, wanting to hear not simple truth, but fables. Tonight, we want to give one more quotation from history. Last evening, we spoke upon the doctrines that have been instituted by chiefly Catholicism, as indicated in the lower left-hand corner of this chart, that they originated from paganism. I gave you one brief quotation. I give you another one tonight. It is taken from a book that gives a quotation from Cardinal Newman. The title of this book is The Development of Christian Religion. You keep in mind that this man is a Catholic. He is not only a cardinal, or was, but a well-known cardinal. That means he held the highest position next to the Pope. He was one of the College of the Cardinals. And he said, temples, incense, oil lamps, votive offerings, holy water, holidays and seasons of devotions, processions, blessings of fields, sacerdotal vestments, the tonsure, that's the habit of the priests and the monks, images are all of pagan origin. That goes on the tape, of pagan origin, from a high-ranking Catholic. There are many other quotations that could be given. That ought to suffice. We are beginning this evening a study of the development of the hierarchical system. That's a big word. Perhaps that's one of the words the young people do not understand. Higher is not exactly as we think of it, higher, but it means layer or level of authority from top to bottom. Now we have 5 of these, precisely as the Roman Empire had 5. Of course, the parish priest is the lowest, and the Pope is the highest, followed by the College of the Cardinals, and on down until we have the archbishops, and we have those that are in between. Now, there is one crown that is worn today that is not like the crown that a king or a queen wears. It is called the 3-crown tiara, or the tiers of 3 crowns. If You've seen the Pope wear it. It's in the form of a high dome. But there are 3 crowns on it. This does not impress people so much today who do not understand Catholic history, but they represent his authority over physical or material and spiritual and political. During the Dark Ages, he ruled the kings. There was to be, in the great struggle between the Roman Empire and the Catholic Church, one superior and the other inferior. It was a non-ending struggle. And for the most part, the Catholic Church had the tools to make a conquest of the people and also to control the leaders. Now, of course, the old Interdict was one of them. If a king or a prince did not do what he wished, he simply placed an interdict upon that country, and no priest was permitted to say Mass for anyone except in an emergency, such as death. Now, they believed that the 7 sacraments were the means of giving the people the blessings of heaven. No one was permitted to administer the 7 sacraments but the priests. And of course, when the interdict was placed upon a country, they could not function. The first ones to cry for help would be the people, and they would ask the ruler to please give in to the Pope so that we can have the things due us. Tonight we want to show you how this happened. In the early years, we have certain controversies. The last 2 nights, we've talked about controversies. We were talking about various sects and groups that differed and disagreed among themselves, but now we're talking about controversies within the Catholic Church. And the first of 3 we submit for your consideration was known as Arianism. Arius was a man who had been a presbyter in one of the contending cities, one of the 5 cities, namely in Alexandria. And of course, he wielded much influence over northern Africa because that at that time was one of the strong bastions of Catholicism. He came into public view about 318 or 320 and said that Christ was neither man nor God. Now, in the past 2 evenings, we showed that there were those who didn't believe Jesus was man. There were those who did not believe that Jesus was God. Here's a man saying, Jesus is neither man nor God. He is a semi-man, semi-God. This involved the church in bitter controversy for 100 years. A brilliant deacon who attended the council at Nicaea, first one of their general councils, came to the front and debated Arius and bested him in the argument, even though himself was not a representative. He, of course, then was the first of 2 great men who was able to do this. We'll notice another one just in a moment, but this man believed in what is called Arianism, that took the divinity and the humanity out of Christianity so that he was not God in the flesh, and he was not God in the flesh. We showed this the other evening from 2 statements from John in 1 John chapter 2, 18 and 22, and again in 2 John, how that if any man says Jesus did not come in the flesh, he's a liar, he's a deceiver. It's so plain. And yet these people denied it. Eventually, they came to a compromise position known as semi-Arianism, but it simply added one more false notion to what was to become the system of Catholicism. Number 2, this doctrine is called Nestorianism. Nestorius, a presbyter of Antioch, another one of the 5 key cities contending for power. Later on, occupying himself in number 1, which is Constantinople. Eventually it was Constantinople in the east, and it was Rome in the west. He was in a high position. And he contended for 2 different things. Now, there are 2 great big words. Monophyletism, Thletism, and one means no will of, that is, no will of man, and that's only the will of God, no nature of man, only the nature of God. Now, what does this mean? It simply means that these people who believed it accepted the fact that Jesus did not have the nature of man. It meant also that Jesus did not have the will of man. If he didn't have the will of man, he could not be tempted. Yet it says, he was tempted in all points like as we, Hebrews 4:15. So all of the real initiative and the example of Jesus is lost. How can he be what Hebrews 6 calls him? The way shower, to give us the courage to face temptation and overcome temptation, if he could never be tempted, never having had the nature nor the will of man. Hebrews is abundant in the teaching, such as found in chapter 2. There is one more that is more important than these 2, known as Pelagianism. Pelagius was a British monk that migrated finally over to Rome and eventually into northern Africa, having great influence both in the mainland of Europe and in the lower continent. There were 4 basic ideas to his belief, and we are going to give these 4 and follow them with Augustine's 4. They are opposites. Number 1, Pelagius believed that man was born not with sin, but with a will. That's correct, right? Okay, now ready for the wrong one. Each individual has a perfect will to choose either good or evil, and said he, a sinless life is possible, and he followed that, it is possible for a man to save himself with good works. That's wrong. Number 3, baptism is unnecessary for infants, like the branch of the Catholics had been teaching. And he said baptism is not essential for babies because sin is not inherited. Now, Augustine has been teaching, as well as others, from about Tertullian's day, and let's call that no earlier than 150 A.D., that because babies are born in sin, they must be baptized. And it's not too thinkable to immerse babies, so they substituted immersion for sprinkling to sprinkle babies. Now, this man says that babies do not inherit sin. They do not have to be baptized because there's no guilt. In this, of course, he's correct. But number 4, salvation is possible without the gospel. And he said it is possible apart from divine grace. For by grace are you saved, Paul wrote to the Ephesians in chapter 2. Now, he admitted that the gospel and the grace of God are helpful in a man saving himself, and he said even Jesus' good example is helpful. How could it be if all of it depends upon human will and Jesus never had the will of man? Couldn't be helpful. This man had a dangerous doctrine, and he was thoroughly put in line by Augustine. Now, Augustine believed the opposite of these, and of course he corrected the man in 2, and the other 2 he was in error. We mentioned that Augustine had written a set of books known as the City of God. Now in this he envisioned God's church as being like a large city. It should not be surprising after we study Catholicism for several centuries that the picture that Augustine set before the readers in the books is the same Catholicism that it came to be. In a sense, it became the blueprint for Catholicism. Augustine said man was created in the image of God, but he sinned. He lost his image of God. He thus lost any will that he might have had, and that babies are born in sin because man inherited the original sin. Now, we'll come across this again under Calvinism. Now, of course, this is hardly true. Jesus was born without a father. So you say, well, to the Catholic, how could it possibly be that Jesus could be born of a woman if babies are born in sin, because they are following the Adamic line? And of course, Jesus was born of a woman, so they come back and they say, well, it so happens that Jesus was born of a virgin. So they must accept the Immaculate Conception of Jesus. Now that simply means that she was not just a virgin, but she had never sinned in her life. That had to be because from Mary, Jesus inherited his human aspect of the human body, and it had to come from Mary. Now if she had sinned, then he would have inherited it. So it brought forth another doctrine later. When a man accepts a certain line of thought, he doesn't finish until he follows that line through. He either accepts it all or he rejects it. Number two, Augustine said that man lost all freedom of choice. His salvation depended solely upon the grace of God. Half of that is correct. Man has a freedom of choice, and he was wrong in that. But it's true that man is dependent upon the grace of God for salvation. Otherwise, we would not have the opportunity. Number three, infant baptism is necessary, he said, without which they cannot be saved. Because they're born in sin, guilty of sin, inherited from Adam. Catholics teach that when we die, we go to hell. When a Catholic dies, he goes to purgatory. When a baby dies without being sprinkled, he goes to limbo. Now, there are three gradations, but of course, you get out of purgatory, and you get out, the babies can get out, but the rest of them can never get out of hell. So they have it so that everyone suffers some torment after death. Number four, said he, God saves some and leaves others to their merited fate. It was not that is Calvin alone that taught this, but also Augustine. Let's turn our attention now to the outward activities that developed Catholicism. There was, for instance, the rise of monasticism. In the Dark Ages, the monasteries were important places. They had many orders. Some of them had the vow of silence from the time they entered in. No one spoke a word at any time except those who transacted business with people who brought food or other materials from the outside. Of silence. We have at least one in the United States. There were two chief reasons why people sought to live in monasteries. One was the invading tribes that came down from the north and the depth of Asia Minor, sweeping across Europe and coming down upon the Roman Empire, were barbarians. And of course, the first thing they would do, burn the fields, kill the animals that they did not use, kill human beings, take some of the women in slavery and on their way to new frontiers. So many of them fled to the mountains to escape those and built the best that they could, for the time being living in caves and finally monasteries. The second reason was Christianity was adopted as a state religion in 400. That's right, adopted as a state religion. At that point, the successors of Constantine outlawed paganism. Now, the result of this was that we had so many hundreds and thousands of people who were brought into the church from paganism. This was the only legal, lawful religion. They brought with them their doctrines, their beliefs, their superstitions, their fables, and baptized into the church. And of course, this filled the church with false doctrines, but also impurity. And men and women began living very impure lives. Now, the most pure of them decided they would retire to secluded places and live with people who were like-minded. Those are the two chief reasons why they lived in monasteries. Now, these were called monks, and sometimes they're called monkeries. They called them the cloisters, and the life was the cloister life. Some monks lived there, others were nuns. There were certain benefits to monasticism, as there is to all things, that may not be good. This is going to cover a span of a number of centuries. When Rome was evacuated by Constantine, and he moved it, from Rome to Constantinople by Constantine, founding the new city, he took with it the libraries. And the libraries were kept there until the fall of Constantinople in 1453. Another interesting thing was that an aftermath of the Crusades, and we'll talk about them later, but there were several crusades that took people from Europe into Palestine. Now, on the way back, many of them brought with them the learning of the East. The Dark Ages settled only over the West, not the East. The East yet was a vigorous empire, but in the West it was subordinated unto the Catholic Church. No one was educated except the princes and the priests. The common man had no education, could not read and write. The Bible would have done him no good. One thing that benefited from this was that they had some place when they brought the learning back from the East and finally the library from Constantinople to the West to place these volumes. And from that there came a lot of learning. The learning was preserved. Many of these men who were monks spent their time copying the scriptures and other books, making other libraries. It's interesting to note that later on, about the time of the Reformation, the Catholics began a counter-Reformation, establishing universities all over Europe. What books would they use? They used the books that came from the monasteries. And eventually these books came to be their undoing. So they had learning in these monasteries to give to the world later. The second thing, they also developed skills. The skills of the ancient Romans and also of the Eastern Empire were maintained. That is, the art of weaving, making cloth, of painting, of sculpturing, whatever it may be. Now, these were all maintained in the monasteries, so that they were virtual universities. Now, when what's called the Renaissance came, or the aftermath of the Dark Ages, they had some tools with which to work, and out of that was born the Reformation. One thing we ought to repeat in passing, which was mentioned 2 nights ago, and that was there were two differences between the East and the West. When Constantine moved the capital from Rome to the place he named Constantinople, it was the Byzantine Empire, or Byzantium, he wanted to do a favor to the church, and so he changed the title of the man from a Metropolitan to become a patriarch. And that sounds a little better, doesn't it? A real nice, aged, respected patriarch. Constantine uttered a statement that was repeated by his followers. It was this, that he was the bishop of bishops. Now you say, well, what does that mean? Very simply, he wanted to bestow a honor to himself. So he said, I am the bishop of the bishops. What he did was to use the taxes of the people to support the clergy. Now, clergy didn't have to worry. They didn't have to worry about invaders, because here's the strong arm of Constantine and his successors. But you know, when a parent is overprotective, it is injurious to the parent and injurious to the child. Later on, the parent will say, well, my kid keeps fussing for this and fussing for that. Why not? If we give him too much freely, he expects it. He complains when he doesn't receive it. The child is ruined and injured. He has not learned to fend for himself. It brought the weakness of that system to the Eastern Empire. But look to the West. It had an abuse also. Because there was a vacuum created when the capital was moved from Rome to Constantinople. There was no real strong arm. There was a young man, a boy emperor, sitting upon the throne, Augustus, and this young man was supposed to be a representative of the Eastern Empire. In other words, controlling the West. No way to do it. The hordes were moving in fast. Now that means the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Franks, the Vandals. There were approximately 8 chief tribes that moved in about 300 years to surround the Roman Empire, and 4 times Rome was approached. Not sacked 4 times, but she received benefit 4 times. The last time, Ottumwa controlled, not just conquered, but controlled the city of Rome. And you'll notice that right here. Now, that was in 476. Now, prior to this time, the strongest voice in Rome was the bishop. And we'll see in a few minutes how that progressed. After Rome fell, there was no leader. There was no one to assume authority except the bishop at Rome. He rose to the occasion. Now, in the East, they developed doctrine quickly. In the West, they developed organization. They said, we must sort out our priorities, and to survive, we have to have a strong organization. And of course, they had it. We focus attention next upon the outstanding leaders of this hierarchical system. Now, we've already told you that it means elevation upon elevation from the bottom to the top, that you have a well-organized system. I'd like to give you the leaders of these. Now, this covers a span of from 300 to 420, 120 years. Athanasius was one. Athanasius was credited with 2 great things. He had a brilliant mind. He opposed Arianism and other doctrines, and as an aftermath of that, he wrote a creed. It's called the Athanasian Creed. It is one of the outstanding creeds of the time. I have the 3 volumes of Philip Schaff's Creeds in Christendom. Now, rather than bring those 3 volumes with me, I made copies of the sections that we'll want next week. Notice either the Nicene Creed or the Athanasian Creed, which are very much alike. But they formed the base of what later became the Catholic Creed. Some have called it the Apostles' Creed, which is a little different too. St. Ambrose, he's called, just call him Amby. Ambrose was a leader, and he was likewise a bishop, whereas Athanasius was not at the time. He is called a great orator, and he opposed Arianism after Athanasius slipped from the scene. So Arianism had two foes in two great men. Number 3 was Chrysostom. Chrysostom is called the Golden Mouth. He too was a great orator, a defender of Catholicism. In fact, they say that he probably had more to do with the development of the hierarchical system than any other one man. Augustine is a man we've already quoted from tonight, and you cannot minimize the influence of Augustine. He has been called the teacher of the Occident. Had considerable influence vocally, but he was noted for his ability as a writer. We've already indicated one set of books, The City of God, that he wrote, but many books are still extant today, or parts of them. The 5th one is Jerome. Now, Jerome was a translator. He translated the only official Catholic translation there is, the Latin Vulgate. I also have with me the charts charted out of the translations. Now, that doesn't mean that every translation you pick up of Catholicism, and I have 2 of these. I have one that's almost unheard of today because it's off the market. But it simply means that's an English translation, always going back to the Latin. They do not go back to the Greek, they go to the Latin Vulgate. Any errors that Jerome might have let slip through will be errors today. Then following this, there was a widening breach between the clergy and the laity. So far, we have named 5 great leaders. Now, following these great leaders will be a host of priests and bishops. Now, I wonder just how close the priests or the bishops, if you want to call them preachers, and the people will be. They deliberately widened this so that the average man would not count himself on the same level with the priests. Why? 4 reasons. One was a financial reason. Both in the East and the West, by this time, the priests were supported financially by the government. Let me just go ahead a little bit to show you how this works out. One of the reasons, and let me say one of the chief reasons for the French Revolution in France was because by the 18th century, we're talking about the 1700s, out of 5/5, 3/5 were owned by the priesthood and the income from it. 2/5 were owned by the peasants, the workers. Now, wouldn't you become upset too? If the United States government owned 3/5 of all the United States, and it supported the preachers from this income, and you, the rest of the people in the United States, had to live off the income of 2/5, we'd hear more than Proposition 13. But of course, this naturally widened the breach because the priests were not dependent upon the people for their offerings. They could tell the people anything they wanted to. And the people couldn't say, listen, priest, if you don't be quiet, we'll withhold our offerings and you'll starve to death, because they would be supported by the state. Number 2, it had its own legal tribune. By this time, no priest was compelled to be tried by the ordinary tribunals and courts. They had the privilege of being tried before the church tribunals, while the people had to be tried through the secular tribunals. Number 3, the clergy became a special order wearing special clothes. And you probably have seen these garments with the collar turned backwards. They had many other peculiarities too, of course. Each one of the orders had garments that were different. Likewise, the Cardinals wore red, whereas the parish priests wore black. Now, this was to distinguish every level, one from the other, and also the priest from the people. Number 4, there was an introduction by that time of tradition. Now, just suppose at that period in history, people had had a Bible, and they had an education to read the Bible. Now, they saw to it that the Bible was taken away. There were no printing presses. It took a monk approximately 1 year to copy the Bible. Now, they did not allow the Bible to be circulated, but they did chain the Bible to the pulpit. And you probably have seen Bibles with a clasp on it in a picture, and that's to indicate the time when the Bible was locked and it was chained to the pulpit. So if people had an education, they could not read it, but to compound it, they had introduced so many traditions, doctrines that cannot be read in the Bible. The people were dependent upon the priests to know what the church taught. There was no other way to acquire the knowledge. Of course, not having printed presses, they could not print their creeds or leaflets to distribute among the people. They became totally dependent upon the priesthood, like a young calf is to the mother. There was, of course, throughout all this, the development of new offices. Now, we'll just name these, as you probably have already listened and heard. The clergy of a city or a territory or of a diocese was ruled over by a bishop. Now, it depends on how many members they had as to how many people were under the bishop. So the bishop was a little different from, say, a monsignor. Now, a parish priest is under the monsignor, but the monsignor is still within what they call a church. He usually is over a church of any size, and the parish priests work under him, but directly over him would be the bishop. In the Council of Nicaea in 323, they sanctioned the appointment of Metropolitans. In other words, they could see that in large cities there would need to be a man who would be over the entire city and area. He was a metropolitan. Later on, the metropolitan was changed to archbishop. Of course, that's a step higher. And the bishops of Rome and Alexander and Antioch, as well as Constantinople, at that time in history, had even more prominence. So they were called patriarchs. Now, patriarch was what was finally used in the East, but later on these are known as cardinals in the Catholic system. The cardinals were the ones in the conclave recently to pick another pope. They occupy what is called the College of the Cardinals. The College of the Cardinals is composed of the cardinals that will have the authority to pick a pope. Now, that was started by Gregory VII at about this point in history. Prior to that time, they picked them at random. They put in who they wanted to. They put a man out and replaced others. Now, they could see the evils of this because up to that time it had been inherited, and too often the inheritance went to a weak man, and they had to strengthen the hierarchical system. So now they had a college of the cardinals to vote in the pope. It's interesting to note that Gregory VII, whose name was Hildebrand, was the maker of popes up to the time he created the College of the Cardinals, that was supposed to create all popes, but then he put himself in as pope, regardless of the College of the Cardinals. It's a poor rule that does not work both ways. This man was playing the game, like the ERA is playing the game. Following these new changes, there was a struggle between the East and the West. Now in the East, it seems that they had some advantage because, after all, the prestige of the Roman Empire that was transferred over to Constantinople would place a little bit of glory and grandeur to the title of the Patriarch. But the fact that the rulers from Constantine's time down called themselves Bishop of Bishops, that they told the bishops, or really the patriarchs, what to do and when to do it, created a very weak organization, a very weak functioning system. While in the West there were many things going for them. Now let's notice in the West a number of things that helped to elevate the Roman system to the high position that it later occupied in the Dark Ages. One was geographical location. You know, somehow or other we associate certain places with certain things. And if there has been a place in which a battle has been fought, like the Alamo, all we have to do is say, remember the Alamo. People say, oh yes, I remember. I've heard of that. Remember Pearl Harbor. Oh yes, I've read about that in history. So, for so long, the generations and the centuries of the people of Europe looked to the West, to Rome, with great feeling of patriotism. The geographical location was a going thing for them. The largeness of the Roman congregation. Now in the East they had many people in the Eastern system, but in the West they were far more numerous. We had a map turned back the last 2 evenings that indicated the clustering of the greatest number of churches through the first 4 centuries on. Most of them were in this area. Not so many in this area. Asia Minor, Palestine, the earliest churches were established. Not too many, however, in, let's say, Greece and Italy. But now it all changed. In the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries, they had the concentration of members. The wealth was great. Much more wealth in the West than in the East. They were also noted for one more trait. And by the way, this is something as Christians we ought never to forget. When Attila the Hun came out and to meet the people that lived in Rome, of course, they didn't have a standing army of any strength. They had tried to beat the enemy back. But he came to the gates of the city and says, "Bring me your riches." And the bishop did something psychologically to his advantage. He did something that was true. Because in that time of history, one of the great things they did was to share what they had with the poor, needy people. He gathered up all these poor people and brought them to the gate of the city and says, "These are our treasures." Why, he was so amazed by that and appreciated it that it was a great benefit in delivering Rome from the enemy. They were hospitable. They shared what they had, who were people of means, with those who were poor. People like that. Somehow they appreciate that. Many people have been brought to Christ because someone in time of need shared what he had with them. And the success in resisting heretical doctrines was much stronger in the West than the East. Now, when I say heretical doctrines, I'm not talking about really what is right and wrong, because they oftentimes rejected the right and defended the wrong. But in the eyes of the people, they could see that in the East, while they were battling their doctrines, trying to bring them to a solidified form, they appeared to give the idea of confusion and uncertainty. And you know, arguments and contentions always bring that. Well, the people can't even decide among themselves what's right. You can about imagine what children go through when they have a squabbling husband and wife who perpetually are arguing. Someone will write down Landers and my husband and I are always fighting about such. What did the children think? If the parents can't make up their mind what's right or what's wrong, what must the children think? What did the people of the East think? It was a little different in the West. It's like old Teddy Roosevelt, speak softly and carry a big stick. I think that's wonderful for policemen, for parents, and for teachers and a few others. You know, about that time you don't have to lash out at them. Just speak softly, carry a big stick, and smile with them. And they'll do it. Lady called me the other day to tell me that she was having a little difficulty along that line. Well, we all have problems in rearing our children, but Rome had learned one of the keys of this. They had a strong functioning system. They handled the heretical teachings, or what they thought or called to be heretical, very quickly. That's a no-no. You see, we have what is called the 7 ecumenical councils, or general councils. These councils were attended both by the bishops of the West and the East. And this carries us through the 800s. That is the 700s, almost 800, 787. After this, there was considerable difference between the East and the West. Great breaches, 4 of these, and finally in 1054, an open and final break. Now, of course, later on, there were going to be differences in the Roman Catholic Church. So you see these are spotted, the green. That indicates that later on, after they consolidated their authority and built their system into a rigid functioning system, they then could handle the problem of the doctrines. By that, the Greek Catholic Church was well nigh dead, lifeless, with no vigor. So there is something to be said for the man who decides that what is right and what is wrong is wrong. Indecisiveness always means defeat. There was a claim of apostolic succession. Now, not tonight, tomorrow night, we want to give a little attention to this. There was a claim that Peter was the first pope, that he lived in Rome. Of course, this was simply a legend, but that's what they claimed. And that God told Jesus to tell Peter, which is in Matthew's account, chapter 16, chapter 18, that he was to tell the apostles that Peter was the chosen one. Now, Jesus said, whom do men say that I am? Jeremiah, John the Baptist. Whom do you say that I am? Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. He said, now flesh and blood hath not revealed this to you, but my heavenly Father. He said, I've got something else I want to tell you. He said, now you're Peter, and upon you I'm going to build a church. That's the way they interpret it. Upon this rock. Of course, you know what the real wording of that is. You're a little pebble, Peter, but upon this boulder I'll build my rock. You're just a little pebble that has acknowledged this great truth that God has given you, that I am the Christ. But upon the whole foundation I'll build my church. But now upon that, along with chapter 18, they say, well, he has the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and the apostles are with him in this. So he is the first pope. We'll save remarks further on this, but you can imagine what the people must have thought when they started pulling scriptures out. You know, people are baffled sometimes. And I started out preaching, hardly a sermon went by that I had anything under than 100 scriptures. Well, I thought that was the way to do it. I just peeled them out. You know, people sat there, their mouths open, they said, I never heard anything like that. But it didn't mean that I spoke a single truth. No guarantee. Only if I handled it right, the word of truth, would it be truth. But it's a baffling thing. Some people use it as gimmicks. I have dropped that through the years. I don't think there's any point in using scriptures unless there is a point. But the people were impressed by the fact that they could pull scriptures out and say, see, Peter was the first pope. Many missionaries at this time were now moving out and away from Rome into other countries. Now, Augustine sent missionaries to Great Britain. And, of course, that gave Christianity in Great Britain at an early date. Also into the Scandinavian countries. Yes, later on, even as far as China. At this time, they were even going into India, or at least to the frontiers of India. Now, of course, this helped to spread the church and make it more popular, because the mother is a very popular person, particularly in the kitchen around mealtime. And the church that is evangelistic, that's helped many people, is well thought of. The barbarian invasions taking place at this time could not be resisted by the emperors. We pointed this out. There was no way for the emperors in the east to send detachments of soldiers to the west and defend the grounds of the old Roman Empire. So if there could be a key man that would rise to the hour and say, fellow citizens, let's get with it, then he had the people, because people love a strong leader in a crisis. Now, they don't like a leader when they're not in need. They'll say, get lost and they'll do one thing. But now when the crisis comes, it's kind of like the bumper sticker that says to the hippie, when you need a policeman, call another hippie. Have you seen that? Well, some people want to do their own thing, and they say, I don't need any help. Until the child needs some help and they start crying, Mama, Mama, come help me. That's the way people in the churches are too. This gave a strong essence to the church in Rome. When Constantine moved thus to Constantinople, the Roman bishop was the key personage in the entire area of old Rome. The bishops gradually took over the functions of the state. Now, I told you about the three-crown tiara. That's right. A little later on, we're talking about the 8th century, the latter part of the 700s. There was created the papal states. Now, we'll see the papal states a little later on in the maps. The papal states created a real political state. From this, the bishop or the pope was able to rule the entire Roman Empire. It's interesting to see also that when they accepted a creed that became a base and didn't have to go too far from that to settle other differences, it helped. In the East, they didn't settle a creed that quickly. They simply settled for the simplicity of what it was, whereas it reached out in the West to the Nicene Creed. The East agreed to most of this, but this then became a base or the foundation upon which the rest of their doctrine would be built. Then later, the Mohammedan conquest. That was to sweep across North Africa, as well as in this area, controlling the churches. Then, of course, up through Spain, across the Straits, and in 732, in the Battle of Tours, they were defeated. In other words, the West was able to put up the men who would defeat the Mohammedans. But the East, they still were troubled and would be until 1453. The Turks had attempted several times to fell the city of Constantinople, but with no success. You can say hats off to the man that can fight a decisive battle like Charles Martel did, as he led the princes of that area and defeated the Mohammedans and turned them back home again as against those that must continually defend themselves. I think these give a real stature unto the papal power. It will be best for tonight, having just a very few minutes left, if we don't begin the next, which is the rise of the papal power within. We've talked about the structure, the basic structure of it, but there is a reason why people were convinced that the teaching of the Catholic Church was right. You say, Everybody can't be fooled, but they can be. They can be if they have an evidence that appears to be 100% genuine. So tomorrow evening, we want to see how that from within, they were not satisfied with saying, we have given you the Council of Nicaea, we have given you the base doctrines, we are giving you a united front of priests and a pope, we are helping the poor people, we are defending the borders, but they reinforced themselves within. And we'll see how that within they were coming out with documentation which they would read from their pulpits that would be convincing to the people. What matter did it mean that if in a few hundred years the Catholic Church itself would admit that they're frauds? At that time, several centuries of people are deceived, are convinced. It simply seems a stroke of honesty later to say, honestly, you've been goofed. That's all. These are frauds. Because they've served their purpose. People have forgotten the stigma of it being a fraud. Because in the meantime, they have accepted and will continue to accept the things that the frauds taught. We have chosen to sing a song tonight that has some real words in it. We've been talking about a man that had a crown and sat upon a throne. When he died, he was replaced with another man, but the same crown, who was supposed to have jurisdiction over material, spiritual, and political affairs of men. And they lost focus of the fact that there was one, as Acts 2 says, he was raised to sit upon the throne of David, raised from the dead, and sits now upon that throne. We want to sing the first two stanzas tonight. While we stand, please. While